I remember a day one winter that stands out like a boulder in my life. Oh, the weather was unusually cold. Our salary had not been regularly paid, and it did not meet our needs when it was. My husband was away much of the time, traveling from one district to another. Our boys were well, but my little Ruth was ailing, and at best none of us were decently clothed. I had patched and repatched with spirits sinking to the lowest ebb. The water had given out in the well, and the wind was blowing through the cracks in the floor. Oh, the people in the parish, they were kind and they were generous too. But it was a new settlement, and each family was struggling for itself. Little by little, at the time I needed it most, my faith began to waver. Early in life, I was taught to take God at His word, and I thought my lesson was well learned. I had lived upon the promises in dark times until I knew as David did, who was my fortress and deliverer. Now, a daily prayer for Thanksgiving was all that I could offer. Oh, my husband's overcoat was hardly thick enough for October, and he was often obliged to ride miles to attend some meeting or funeral. And many times our breakfast was Indian cake and a cup of tea without sugar. Christmas was coming. The children always expected their presents. I remember the ice was thick and smooth, and the boys were each craving a pair of skates. Ruth, in some unaccountable way, had taken a fancy that the dolls I had always made her were no longer suitable. She wanted a nice, large wax doll and insisted on praying for it. I knew it was impossible, but oh, how I wanted to give each child his present. It seemed to me as if God had deserted us. Oh, I did not tell my husband all this. He worked so earnestly and heartily, I supposed him to be as hopeful as ever. I kept our sitting room cheerful, and I tried to serve our meals as cheerfully as I could. The morning before Christmas, James was called away to see a sick man. I put up a piece of bread for his lunch. It was the best I could do. I wrapped my plaid shawl around his neck, and I tried to whisper a promise, as I often had. But the words died away upon my lips, and I let him go without them. Oh, that was a dark, hopeless day. I coaxed the children to bed early, for I could not bear their chatter. When Ruth went, I listened to her prayer. She asked for the last time, most explicitly, for skates for her brothers and for her doll. Her bright face looked so lovely when she looked up and whispered to me, "You know, I think they'll be here early tomorrow morning, Mama." But I thought I could move heaven and earth to save her from disappointment. I sat down alone and gave way to the most bitter tears. Before long, James returned, chilled and exhausted. He drew off his boots, and the thin stockings clipped off with them, and his feet were red with cold. Oh, I wouldn't treat a dog that way, let alone a faithful servant. And as I glanced up, I saw the hard lines and the look of despair. It flashed across me that James, too, had let go. I brought him a cup of tea, and we sat for an hour without saying a word. I wanted to die, and I wanted to meet God and tell him his promises weren't true. My heart was so full of rebellious despair. As we sat there, I thought I heard the sound of bells. There was a knock at the door. James sprang up to open it. Why, there was Deacon White. "A box came by express just before dark. Reckoned it must be for Christmas, so I thought you shall have it tonight. I brought it around as soon as I could get away, and I do believe these other things belong with you, for you. Here's a turkey my wife asked me to fetch along. And these other things you can look at later. Oh, there was a basket of potatoes and a bag of flour. And talking all the time, he hurried in the box, and then with a hearty good night, he rode away. Still without speaking, James found a chisel and opened the box. He drew out first a thick red blanket. We saw that beneath it the box was full of clothing. It seemed at that moment as if Christ fastened upon me a look of reproach. James sat down and covered his face with his hands. I can't touch them. Do you know that I could not help but know how you were feeling, and I had no word of comfort to offer? I know now how to preach the awfulness of turning away from God. Oh, wait a moment, James. Let us ask God together to forgive us. He said, wait a moment, dear, I cannot talk now. Then he went into another room. I knelt down, and all the bitterness and all the stubbornness rolled away. Jesus came again and stood before me with the loving word, daughter. Sweet promises of tenderness and joy flooded my soul. I was so lost in praise and gratitude that I forgot everything else. I do not know how long it was before James returned, but I knew he too had found peace. Now, my dear wife, let us ask God together to forgive us. And he then poured out words of praise, Bible words for nothing else could express our thanksgiving. It was 11 o'clock. The fire was low, and there was the great box with nothing touched but the warm blanket we needed. We piled on some fresh logs, and we began to examine our treasures. Oh, we drew out an overcoat, and I made James try it on. Just the right size, and I danced around him, for all my lightheartedness had returned. Then there was a cloak, and he insisted on seeing me in it. Oh, my spirits always affected him so, and we both laughed like foolish children. There was a warm suit of clothes and 3 pair of woolen hose. Why, there was a dress for me in yards of flannel, a pair of Arctic overshoes for each of us, and in mine a slip of paper. It was just Jacob's blessing to Asher. Thy shoes shall be iron and brass, and as thy days, so shall thy strength be. In the gloves, evidently for James, the same dear hand had written, I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, fear not, I will help thee. It was a wonderful box, and it was packed with such thoughtful care. There was a suit of clothes for each of the boys, and a little red gown for Ruth. There were mittens and scarves and hoods, and down in the center a box. We opened it. There was a great wax doll. Oh, I burst into tears, and James wept with me for joy. It was too much. And then we both exclaimed again, for close behind it came 2 pair of skates. There were books for us to read, some of them I had longed to see. Stories for the children, aprons and underclothing, knots of ribbon, a little teddy, a lovely photograph, needles and buttons and thread, and actually a muff, and an envelope containing a $10 gold piece. At last we cried over everything we took up. It was past midnight, and we were faint and exhausted, even with happiness. I made a cup of tea, cut a fresh loaf of bread, and James boiled some eggs. We drew up the table before the fire. How we enjoyed our supper. And then we sat talking over our life and how sure help God had always proved. You should have seen the children the next morning. The boys raised a shout at the sight of their skates. Ruth caught up her doll and hugged it tightly and went into her bedroom and knelt down by her bed without saying a word. Then when she came back, she whispered, I knew it would be here, Mama, but I wanted to thank God just the same, you know. Then there was James calling me over to the window, and there were the boys out of the house already skating on the ice with all of their might. My husband and I both tried to return thanks to the church in the East that sent us the box, and have tried to return thanks unto God every day since. Hard times have come again and again, but we have trusted in Him, dreading nothing so much as a doubt of His protecting care. For we have realized that they that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing.